I present a warm welcome to all of you wherever you're watching us from on behalf of the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement and Water Policy Center. It gives me great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished chair, Professor Arvind Kumar, speakers and participants who registered for the event. We are so glad that you could join us today at the NICE WPC International Conference on Post-Pandemic World Order, Navigating the New Normal. Today is the third and the last day of the conference, which was inaugurated on 29th August 2020 by Mr. Pradeep Guawali, Foreign Minister of Nepal, and Dr. Abdullah Rashid Ahmad, State Minister of Maldives, and other high dignitaries. We have around 150 experts and speakers joining us from 30 different countries who have been delivering their presentations and sharing their expertise with us. This is the 27th session of the conference, and to chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Professor Arvind Kumar here with us. Chair, Professor Arvind Kumar is currently Professor of Geopolitics and International Relations and heads the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at MAHE. In addition to his teaching, he has been conducting policy and academic research on a number of themes, including strategic technologies for national security, S&T dimension of foreign policy, nuclear issues, and strategic capabilities of China and Pakistan. He has held a number of visiting assignments both in India and abroad. He has a number of publications to his credit. He is also a member of editorial committee of a number of journals and is a member of a number of professional and academic bodies, including International Studies Association. He holds a PhD from JNU, New Delhi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rafia Khan. And I'm really very pleased to be a part of this panel. This panel is really very important because the way the things have been identified are very, very relevant and significant. But let me at the outset compliment Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for thinking of such themes and also arranging such a huge mega 3-day seminar. I think is very important. And also I see our dear friend, Mr. Bavaskar is sitting. So thank you very much for really working with him and doing this great job. We compliment and we acknowledge you. This panel, again, we have 4 speakers, and each of the speaker, I will speak few things about their theme and then request them to make presentation for something around 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'll really go ahead for Q&A if there are questions. Dr. J. Jagannathan, he is currently Assistant Professor, Department of National Security at University of Jammu. And he has chosen a very relevant theme. It's border and transboundary water issues. And that perhaps is one of the important and highly debated theme right now in the current dynamics of geopolitics. We have Dr. Kishore Munir, and she is a STEM professor at University of Lahore. She also has been the research fellow at the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research, and obviously has been very, very actively engaged in her research. And her theme of the presentation would be transboundary water conflicts. Anyway, I just ask later why she has chosen and the word conflict, because the case study which she's going to discuss perhaps is a classic case study that how 2 adversaries can work together. But she has chosen the theme transboundary water conflicts, a case study of Indus Water Treaty. We have Dr. Mahnaz Darijal.
Sir, she is absent. She is not well, so she has dropped. We have only 3 persons in this panel.
Okay, I'm very sorry. I was not aware about this. She was from Police Academy of Sciences in Poland. Now, the third speaker is Dr. Santesh Kumar Singh, a very prolific academic. He has been working on public health issues, and his title is Infectious Disease and Future of Non-Traditional Threats to National Security. And he is currently Associate Professor at Central University, Haryana. We would like to see that how best they can bring certain important specific, I think, issues in their presentation, and then we can have a good discussion on these themes. Now I will request Dr. J. Jagannathan to make his presentation.
Thank you, Professor Arvind Kumar sir, for the kind introduction. And I would like to thank NICE for organizing this mega event. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts and on this particular theme of the session today.
Would you be slightly louder?
Yeah. Yeah. Can you? Is it audible, sir?
No, no, it was not audible. Now I think you can. Yeah.
Yeah. Just my. Yeah. Uh, so today I'm going to just share some of my thoughts on the topic border and transboundary water issues. That's my theme. Uh, this is actually to examine that how the post COVID-19, how the post COVID-19, how we are going to be dealing with our borders. Traditionally, we have been having the disputes, especially in the Trans-Himalayan region. That is my focus, and also the transboundary water issues, which has been quite well managed without any major sort of conflict or a major despite there were 3-4 wars fought between two nuclear rivalries, but there was not much conflict over water in the past 70, 80, 70 years. So that has been a kind of a stabilizing force for the past 70 years. But now, post COVID-19, so I'm going to read that there are some trends, then accordingly, sort of flagging some of the issues and some of the arguments, put forth my arguments. The structure of the presentation is into two aspects. One is I'm going to discuss about the border issues in the post-COVID-19, which there are a lot of trends have been evolving since March or since January this year, and also the transboundary water issues in the Trans-Himalayan region and how this will affect. Here, I would like to stress emphasis on there is a strong link which we cannot ignore between the borders and the transboundary water issues, and which has a strong linkages, and geopolitics also put sort of impact of pressure on this particular relationship, the link between the transboundary waters, the water issues, and then border issues. So we cannot segregate or see as two separate entity. As you know, we last week can study about any other cases in elsewhere. Here in India, in this context, especially in Indian context or South Asian context, here we need to see the resources. Borders does not mean a sort of a line. It means a cultural resources. We share cultural resources, religion, ethnicity, and language. So a lot of other factors. So this is the region which I have selected, this Trans-Himalayan region, for a simple reason that the developments which happened for last 6 months, which is quite different from how it used to be managed before. There were sort of a mechanism which would able to resolve or any sort of crisis respond to mechanism, but that is not effectively happening now. So I can cite few examples of the Galwan clash happened started in month of April. Then you had a India Nepal the relationship was strained around the time. So this is actually a sort of indications of the trend which is evolving, and to suggest that how we are going to have or deal with the boundary issues and the border security, not only the Indian aspects, also from the countries which is also shared borders. So, so two objectives, I'm aiming two objectives in this presentation. One is to analyze the impact of this COVID-19 on border security management strategy, which is being practiced by the border sharing countries like India, China, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, so all the countries, and also how analyze that how this geopolitical competition has intensified by the pandemic and affects this transboundary water issues. So there is a layer of this geopolitical competition which has been intensified or aggravated by this pandemic, and how it affects this transboundary water issues as well. There is a huge stress on the resource, the necessity for the resources. So we are much more moving towards a sort of a geopolitical, classic geopolitical thinking of classic geopolitical notion rather than the liberal globalized world order. So that debate seems to be over for me after this COVID-19. So we will globalization will be different, or new definitions is required. So borders here, I'm going to focus on three borders: India, Pakistan, which is primarily focusing on the line of control. Then you have India and China, the line of actual control, and India, Nepal, the relationship, and also the border relationship. So India, Pakistan, as far as India-Pakistan border is concerned, my observation is that this is everybody knows that everybody would agree that it is one of the most volatile and tense border in the world. But the ceasefire agreement was signed in 2003. and the ceasefire was maintained, although there is some sort of sporadic violations happened from the both sides, but it was been maintained at least until 2013. But there is a data suggests there has been a spike in ceasefire violations in since 2013, and this graph will also it gives a sense of thing that how this ceasefire violation has been increased and rising, and what are the factors which cause this ceasefire violations. So that is one of the questions comes to my mind, that why there is a spike in ceasefire violations in Pakistan since 2013. My idea is to not to blame or just put a thing on the only one side. But I'm trying to put an argument from this from the perspective that how there is a sudden increase of the ceasefire violations in 2013 by the Pakistan. I would see there is a relationship between the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which was launched in 2013, which cut across the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which is a disputed area between India and Pakistan, and that does also have some sort of resonance on the basic the LOC and India, because if you look at the previous dialogues which happened with the track 2 and the track 1 level and official level in India and Pakistan on this LOC issues, there is a sort of mutually accepted agreement that so we have to meet in the status quo, and we don't want to disturb the status quo as far as LOC is concerned. So that is sort of an agreement in even the track 2 level and also the official level. So, but it runs, but the BRI has a sort of what do you call tilted this balance, and sort of created some sort of according. This is my argument, sort of things, and I have the data to substantiate this argument. Also, the BRI, especially the CPEC, is seen as Pakistan seen although it's seen as a game changer, but the India does not support CPEC because it violates its sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is an official stand of BRI. To substantiate this argument, we have the data show even in the Pakistan media and the Pakistan reports from the Pakistan scholars also suggest from the macro assessment, the CPEC since 2013 shows that China benefited more than what Pakistan supposed to be benefit from the CPEC, although it is claimed by particular section that it is actually going to be a game changer. Also, there is a clear cut the fact that within the Pakistan, the sense of feeling that the CPEC is totally under the control of the Pakistan army, which also sort of creates more doubt and in terms of that how this is going to build a stability in the region, especially particularly the disputed area and the LOC. So it is whether CPEC is a game changer or a spoiler for Pakistan. I think it is a very good point to research, but we need to see the facts. I think perhaps that if you see from the reports coming out from the Pakistan itself, some of the very well researched reports indicates multiple aspects of the CPEC, and so far the last 5 years of assessment indicates in a different direction. So according to my argument that this developments in 2013, you saw that 2000 you saw that Pathankot attack or Uri attack in 2000 followed by surgical strike. Then you had Balakot strike. Then Indo-Pakistan, the tension, that war sort of like of situation. So all it indicates that this LOC has been again brought to the fore in the India-Pak relationship, where we are now moving towards more of confrontation and war rather than sort of cooperation or sort of bringing sort of cooperation or conflict resolution or some sort of things. So this actually negates the argument, the proposition put forth by the BRI, the China, the BRI in official statement that BRI is actually going to create more cooperative mechanism. It will bring more actors to be part of this this initiative, and it will ensure that China's rise is a peaceful rise. So this is an argument which is put forth, but it negates the argument. So this is one of the argument that as far as the Indo-Pakistan border is concerned, that my submission is that in the post-COVID-19, now you had the development of the J&K Reorganization Act, which has made Jammu and Kashmir as a union territory and Ladakh as a separate union territory. This is a major political development from the Indian side, and there is also development which is happening to integrate the Gilgit-Baltistan from the the Pakistan also trying to integrate into the full-fledgedly integrate into the Pakistan. So these are all indicates that both there is a attempt and to change the status quo in everybody in actors in their own favor, being it in India's wanted to do it. Now the JNK Reorganization Act, there are arguments that the JNK reorganization is actually has created a sort of a instability or in the region, which I totally negate because the JNK Organization Act in the time in which it was brought, it is does not make any sort of political domestic political compulsion. Rather, it is a sheer geopolitical based on the sheer geopolitical reading of what is happening around the JNK. And one factor I would suggest that the way the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor has been turned into be a more of a sort of a political security corridor, and that is going to be the one of the reasons for creating this instability. So LOC is going to be remain as again a more not only the volatile, and it is going to be a major flashpoint in the post-COVID-19, and how India and Pakistan is going to navigate in this particular new sort of things, and we have to see. As far as the India-China border is concerned, my focus is on the line of actual control, which is scattered in 3 areas of northern Indian states. Like eastern, you have the Sikkim to Arunachal Pradesh, the western side, Ladakh and Kashmir, and in the middle, Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. So here my focus is on the western end. We had see the sort of a standoff between Indian forces and Chinese forces in Galwan Valley, and we had even a clash after 1962.
You have only 5 minutes.
Clash. Yeah, I'll end up. This is the major clash. So the Galwan clash, the India-China army, the standoff in Galwan Valley also indicates that the China is trying to protect its BRI or CPEC interest, and for that it's mobilizing, trying to exert its pressure on India to persuade India to stop the construction of border infrastructure up to the Dalok Beg only base, which is ridiculous when China is actually involving in building infrastructure along the disputed area, and without any, even though any legal legitimate legitimacy over in that area. So this is itself shows that China's rise is not a peaceful as it has been portrayed and projected, and it is more aggressive and a sort of a bullying. This is what my submission. So what I could see that in the BRI may lose its momentum in the post-COVID-19 world order, given the conditions of the economic activities in the Europe and other continents where BRI is integrated. So it is going to create more localized conflicts and issues, and where the Chinese have invested and in terms of the infrastructure developments, and the Chinese are going to protect their interests at any go, even use force, and that is going to happen. As far as the India-Nepal border is concerned, the relationship is not as good as it used to be. Like now, it's been strained. Both in India and Nepal share 800-kilometer border with more than 6,000 villages across the border Bihar districts. But in the region, if you see the COVID-19 has totally abruptly stopped this cross-border movement since March 2020. If you see the estimate from the January to March itself, more than 5 lakh people have crossed in 49, 50, around 50 transit points between India and Bihar, the Bihar of Indian side and Nepal. So which means now the cross-border movement has been stopped. This is a big problem for the people's movement, and the people-to-people, even in the Tibet relationship is going to be strained. And whether the relationship will be different after the pandemic or it is going to stabilize, I think that how the both countries play the diplomatic cards and depends on that. But I'm sure that in the post-COVID world, India-Nepal this border is going to be again tense to one. Coming back to the transboundary issues, here I would like to just briefly focus on 2 major levels. I'm not going to detail. One is the transboundary waters. One is the Indus Water Treaty, which you are seeing there. Then the second one is the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna Basin, GBM Basin. So these 2 basins are going to have more problematic and more tensions, more problems is going to come up. I think the Indus Water Treaty, this is next month going to be the 68th anniversary of the signing of Indus Water Treaty, and there is a sort of already the issues, the tension has been started when a couple of weeks back, when the Pakistan side asked access to have a physical meeting where the Indian side refused due to the pandemic. So there is a technical issues where the Pakistan wants to plot it to the Permanent Court of Arbitration to monitor it, where India wanted to resolve it bilaterally. So there is an attempt by, there seems, it is in my reading is that Pakistan, there is a deliberate attempt to make Indus water issue as a international issue, bring the World Bank and try to renegotiate in the present context. And this debate has already been going through in the Pakistan academic circle also. I think my colleague will going to speak. I look forward to hear from her as well. But the point here is the Indus water is the major stress. Again, I'm not blaming China, but there is a problem. There is an issue that the hydropower projects which Chinese are constructing in Gilgit-Baltistan, be it a dam or hydro projects in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, is on the Indus rivers. Like Jhelum, last time they have agreed to construct a dam. So this will again further aggravate the what you call the most stable treaty which between India and Pakistan, which survived 4 wars. The last point I would like to highlight is Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna basin. Again, there is going to be a renewed sort of a conflict or confrontation going to come on this sharing of Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna, given their bilateral current status of the bilateral relationship, and we have to see that more sort of stress on these things. Overall, my submission is that in the post COVID-19, it is not going to be the traditional the territory based or the land based or the conflict between India or in India's neighbor border between the Trans-Himalayan region. It is going to be sheerly a resources based conflict which is going to come up. Maybe it's not going to be a continued conflict, but it is going to pop up and it is going to be a big thorn in the bilateral relationship with many of these countries. And it doesn't mean that it's not a big grand narrative of cornering one country of other or one country is occupying other, but this is going to continue in the immediate future. So how to navigate in this particular volatile sort of anarchical environment which is we are going to face, in particular in Trans-Himalayan region, is the one option I would suggest is a multilateralism, and all the leaders must understand, or we have to drive the point that we need to work in a multilateral framework where all countries can rather than looking at the bilateral, because the bilateral mechanism so far creates more trust deficit than the multilateral. So multilaterally we need to involve. For instance, if we have a conflict with, if we have a standoff with China in Galwan Valley, now you see everything China is there in Nepal. So when our relationship strained in with Nepal, it is not a bilateral, it is actually a trilateral one. It has emerged as a trilateral one. So this is the problem which we had seen how the mainstream media and the popular opinion has been mobilized, and that is going to affect the overall interest of the actors playing in this particular region. I look forward to hear more questions and answers. These are my issues I would like to try. And thank you once again, and thank you for the organizer, the chair for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jagannathan. I think you really brought out a lot of salient points. But when you discuss about boundary and boundary issues, I think you should have also covered the other boundaries. India shares boundary with 7 countries. And each of the boundary for India and India's national security is very important. In your conclusion, one sentence you made, and that again requires more elaboration. I hope you will speak after all the presentations are over. You said that borders will become more volatile and tensed. So here you have to be very specific. Which borders you are talking about? India already has been facing or confronting challenges from the borders with Pakistan. It has its own concerns from the borders with China. Borders with Nepal, as you know, is now a new streak up because of the new map which Nepal has already passed in their parliament. So which border would become more tense and volatile? Because there are 7 borders which India has been sharing, and each of the border is important for India's national security. One factual thing I would like you to recheck. What had happened that after the attack on Indian Parliament in December 2001, both India and Pakistan had mobilized their army neck to neck across the border. And that crisis lasted for more than 10 months. And the ceasefire was signed in 2002 October, not 2003. So just check that. You are an expert on national security, you know better. Just check on that fact. And we'll discuss the other things maybe after all the 3 presentations are over. Now I call upon Dr. Kishwar Munir, and she is going to speak on Trans-Boundary Water Conflicts, a case study of Indus Water Treaty. Over to Dr. Kishwar Munir.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to share my presentation, that is Trans-Boundary Water Conflict, a case study of Indus Water Treaty. And the objective of my study is, if India unilaterally revoked the study, what would be the implication for the regional peace and security? My slides are visible?
No, it's not.
No, this is not, nothing is coming.
Okay, just wait. Okay,
And you are also not visible.
so is it visible now?
Yes.
Okay, so due to the to avoid any disruption of internet, I just turned off my video. Okay.
No problem. No problem.
Okay. Okay, let's discuss about the water. Water is essential for sustaining and maintaining the ecosystem, and scarcity of fresh water has altered the world in general and South Asia in particular. And water has been a basic source of conflict in most of the conflicts of the world, and South Asia comprises about a quarter of the global population, having less than 5% of the world's annual renewable water resources. So due to the acute shortage of water in Africa, Middle East, Asia, and elsewhere, it is predicted that future wars could be fought over the excess of fresh water. Conflict theory examines diverse modes of interpreting conflict and suggests various ways to tackle a range of problems arising within and between the countries. Negotiations among rival parties often face challenges that in turn creates a role of mediators who can facilitate communication and assist in foregoing compromises. Facilitation is essential to initiate dialogue to resolve and settle conflicting issue in such a way that enhance reconciliation and justice. In 2002, the Committee of Economic and Social Cultural Right, and then in 2010, the United Nations recognized access to clean water and sanitation as basic human rights. What it proclaims that state must guarantee the right of everyone to sufficient, safe, and acceptable, physically accessible and affordable water for personal and domestic use. So the Human Rights Declaration to Water and Sanitation implies the inclusion in international practice of certain values, rules, and regulation in the current model of water resources management. The implementation of the human right to water is now a set of obligations and rights, not only in the domestic sphere, but also in foreign affairs. Its applicant can have huge geographical implication because most of the water resources that exist across the planet are transboundary. Transboundary basin territories comprises nearly 50% of the land area. More than 30 countries are located entirely in transboundary basin territories, and with the total population of almost or more than 800 billion people. So management of water resources in international basin has become a matter of international security. And with regard to the field of international basin, international relations, the general comment included in the Human Rights to Water established the following guidelines. Due to the stress of the time, I'm just not going to read these guidelines, but I had drawn certain conclusion from these guidelines. Number one, the states should be the most responsible guarantor of the human right to water and its territory, respecting, implementing it, and punishing domestic and foreign actors, preventing or limiting the enjoyment of this right to any sector or community. The second important is the cross-border cooperation between states is key element to ensure the human right to water. Therefore, state must ensure not only the human right to water in its own territory, but also in the territories of the neighboring countries implementing policy of cooperation. The third one is very important, that this water should not be used by a state as a weapon of political and economic pressure against the other states. Water security, the first idea about water and security can be found in a number of paper published in the 70s or late 80s. What the main idea of these publication was that most of the conflict between states are rooted in competition for territory or natural resources that also include water. If natural resources are in decline, conflict tend to increase in many cases. The scarcity of natural resources is connected to the degradation of the environment. Therefore, the environment, water resources, and scarcity are intricately linked. So Dixon in his article identified 3 types of conflict resulting from the environmental changes. Number one is the simple scarcity conflict that are explained and predicted by the general structural theories. They are the conflicts we would expect when state actors rationally calculate their interest in zero-sum situation or negative sum situation. These conflicts arise from resource scarcity and then the group identity conflict. These conflicts are likely to arise from the large scale of movements of population about by the environmental changes, and then the relative deprivation of conflict that indicates developing society, the peoples who belong to developing society produce less wealth because of environmental problem. Their citizens will probably become increasingly discontent by the widening gap between their actual level of economic and achievements. So in Dixon's opinion, the conflicts about water are determined primarily by the scarcity of resources motivated by the environmental anomalies. So Clegg in his article has given us a wider and essential political vision of water conflicts. And I group these threats in 5 categories. Number 1 is the control of water resources. The number 2 is a military tool. Number 3 is a political tool, terrorism, military target, development of the dispute. It's you can see the slides that the control of water resources mean when where water supplies or excess of water is at the root of tension. Number 2, military tool, where water resources, water system are used by nation state as a weapon during military action. Number 3 is a political tool, where water resources or water system are used by nation or non-state actors for political gain. The terrorism, where non-state actors target are either resources, water system, water resources are targeted tool of violence or coercion by non-state actors. Then the military target, where water resources or water system are target of military action by nations or states. Development dispute, where water resource or water system are a major source of contention and dispute in the context of economic and social development. So water dispute between Pakistan and India, it's originated from partition of subcontinent when water regions and diversion structures were not given any consideration while demarcating political boundaries between Pakistan and India. And a gateway to Kashmir was included in India that provided it with the easy access to Kashmir, which is origin or pathway of the waters of the Indus River system. Resultantly, most of the headwaters of the Indus and its tributaries went under Indian control, including Moodpur headworks on the river Ravi, Firozpur headworks, etc. These headworks were feeding Upper Bari Doab and Dipalpur Canal. India blocked supply of these canals, thereby depriving irrigation water to the substantial tract of its fertile command area in Pakistan. Pakistan irrigated area suffered badly in these days, and then after that, an interim standstill agreement was signed in 1947, whereby partial supply was ensured till up to March 1948. In a block supply of Bari Doab again, and resultantly the important Kharif crop of Pakistan was badly damaged. Inter-Dominion agreement was signed in 1948. Then India claimed that all the water of eastern rivers and demanded payment from Pakistan for the received water, whereas Pakistan contended to pay only for operation and maintenance, not for water that belonged to Pakistan prior to partition. All these scenarios and this situation and circumstances necessitated immediate resolution of the dispute for future use and distribution of combined waters. What is the India's claim and the Pakistan claim? India claimed that proprietary rights of water of the rivers in Indian Punjab and refused to accept Pakistan demand of providing due share of those water based upon the time-honored formula that the prevailing uses were in viable and excess water should be divided proportionate to area and the population of the riparian. The stance of Pakistan was in accordance with the accepted principle adopted in several treaties between states and provinces in the subcontinent. So moving towards the Indus Water Treaty, and the negotiation recommended in 1952 under the auspices of World Bank, and after the prolonged bumpy proceedings, an agreement with what is called the Indus Water Treaty was finally signed in September 1960 that took effect retrospectively from 1st April 1960. Okay, so the features of the Indus Water Treaty that distinguish it from other water treaties is number 1 is a short document of 12 articles and a short preamble and 8 extravagant annexes and appendixes. But the intricate and the verbose due to annexes attach it to highly technical and provide ground for the future disagreements. The second is feature of the Indus Water Treaty is that is distinguished from other treaties that it apart from Pakistan and India, the World Bank is also party to it, but being a party to the treaty, World Bank does not enjoy the same judicial status as India's Pakistan does. The third conspicuous feature of the treaty is that it's a water sharing, but water dividing treaty which divides the river between Pakistan and India. They are the provision related to that divide the rivers between Pakistan and India. Eastern River has been allocated to the India and for unrestricted use and barred Pakistan from interfering the water of these rivers. Whereas the treaty allocates the same right to Pakistan of the Western River, but as these rivers flow from India, treaty allows India to use water for electricity generation and to build storage of maximum quantity within the defined perimeters outlined in detailed annexure of CDE. So India Water Treaty also obligates both the Pakistan and India and binds them to prevent undue population. But the term undue population in criteria of reasonableness have not been defined and didn't take into account the future pollution problems that will arise due to the industrialization, urbanization, rapid population growth, because these were not the phenomena at the ratification of at the time when the treaty was ratified by both the states. So this provision could be the source of tension between the two, especially when the Pakistan is the lower riparian states. Okay, the Indus Water Treaty has also provided the conflict resolution mechanism to avoid the future conflict which may arise in after the implementation of treaty, and PIC was established in the Treaty for Information Exchange and to further cooperation to avoid any conflict. And the Article 11 of the treaty deals with the settlement of the differences and dispute which may arise between the party concerning the interpretation of and the application of the treaty. So if the question arises with respect to the implementation of the treaty, the Commission will try to examine the situation and present the solution. If Commission fails to address the question, the difference is deemed to have arisen and the commissioner may request the appointment of neutral expert. And if neutral expert thinks the difference should be treated as dispute in accordance with the provision of paragraph 3, 4, and 5, then commission report the fact to the government, and then on which the commission is in agreement that the issue is a dispute, and the view of each commissioner on these issues and his reason in each such condition, the 7-member Tribunal Call Court of Arbitration would take care of it. And these are the few examples when these method has been resorted by both the states. So territorial scope of the treaty, as the water of the Indus water flows from and river flows from the disputed territory of Kashmir, and it's a background there why they didn't mention the Kashmir undisputed region in the territory. In the crafter of the treaty, carefully handled the issue by passing it through Article 11 of para 1. It stated it governs the right and the obligation of each party in relation to the other with respect only to use of the water of the rivers. And however, both parties disagree on the scope of the article, and it's been highlighted during the Kishanganga case where Pakistan objected it. So the issue or dispute arises after the implementation of the treaty, and from the ratification of the treaty in 1960 to 1970, there was not a single water issue between the two countries. The issue popped up when India decided to build dams for electricity generation purpose on western rivers. Following the water dispute erupted between the two states, and the number of likely to increase in future as India has planned a series of such projects which are in various stages of implementation. These are the few projects, and there are the other in pipeline which India is planning to initiate. So there are the few challenges which they are threatening challenges which can contribute in revocation of treaty and can lead to the war between the two states. We'll discuss later whether it lead to the war or not. So Kashmir is another, after the Kashmir, the primary route, the second most contentious issue between the both states is the water issue. So Kashmir is a disputed region from the disputed river, and on many occasions when tension heightened, India has threatened to abrogate the treaty. So water scarcity. These are the few details that it shows the level of water stress and the availability of annual renewable fresh water. That's the Pakistan's water availability from 1950s to 2050 is predicted. If the per capita annual water availability in a country ranges from 1,000 to 2,000 per person, this status is considered as a water stress. If it is below 1,000 cubic meter, it is considered as water scarcity situation. Pakistan's available per capita water is 1,000 cubic meter to qualify as water stress country. And as per the United Nations Development Program, Pakistan will be water scarce by 2025. And Pakistan concerns is mostly related with this agriculture sector, which contributes to 21% to its GDP and implies over 45 of the country labor force. So as 93 of the Pakistan agriculture depend on the river water, the situation is very critical. The issue has layers of complexities.
You
Three
have
of the
3 minutes
rivers.
left.
How many?
3 minutes left.
Okay,
3.
I'll try to skim them. So there are the other factors: the population growth, degradation of the Indus water, Indian development of the hydro development projects by the India on the western rivers, and Pakistan's complexity. Okay, I will go to the threat to the existence of the treaty that we will discuss. That treaty is still intact despite the various disputes related to the water sharing and has survived wars that broke out between Pakistan and India. But recently in 2019, Modi had promised the farmers of Punjab that he will stop the water flow and divert the water into states. And this famous statement that the blood and water cannot flow together. On all these situations, the question arises that why would India want to scuttle the treaty? So the first is much evident that the World Bank report that India is increasingly becoming a water sufficient country and attribute this population growth. And the second is to keep Pakistan under pressure for security reason. So I'll also skim that argument. We can discuss later after the presentation. Can India unilaterally withdraw from the treaty? There are the three aspects: legal, political, and institutional. Legally, no country can unilaterally violate and abolish a bilateral treaty following the Vienna Convention and also the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights on the Water Source Convention, civil and political rights, prevent India from blocking water access to Pakistan, which would directly constitute a human right violation because access to water is a basic human right. Then the political term, in terms of real politics, India's unilateral decision to withdraw from treaty will damage its global reputation and will not go well with its neighboring country with whom India has signed treaties on water sharing. Then institutional capacity, India doesn't have the institutional capacity to build reservoirs to store water from the Indus and building of storage on the Western River projects could take 10 to 15 years to build to India, and there's no nippy or easy way to divert the water of these rivers to anyway. So that is if Indus Water Treaty is a successful illustration of conflict resolution, and if we see the progression of issues from question to differences and arbitration shows that the conflict of water has been worsening the time between the two nuclear states. In view of Pakistan, dependence on Indus Water for irrigation and human consumption, if India cut off or reduce water flow, its implication would be disastrous water security and its implication on the region. Pakistan view the construction dams and reservoirs free on the Western River for the purpose of power generation with the capacity to withhold or reduce water at critical moment as a threat to its water security. And Pakistan's various leaders, former army chiefs responded to these as a serious threat to Pakistan's security. And even US Senate Foreign Relations in 2012 that acknowledged that the number of dams under construction by India and their cumulative effect of these projects could give it the ability to store enough water to limit the supply to Pakistan at crucial moment in the growing sea. So can this act of India trigger a war? International bodies have predicted that the country's war. CIA reports observing that water issues likely to continue or be a major source of conflict between India and Pakistan in coming decades. But there are also different authors who rely on the freshwater transfer boundary databases that there have been 145 water-related treaty has signed this period, and the cooperation overrides the confrontation between states, and only 7 skirmishes have been placed between states. So there are the few recommendations. The Article 7 of the Treaty on Future Cooperation for Sustainable Management on Indus Basin in optimal manner should be used, and CBMs on hydropower development should be created, and transparency in data sharing regarding the construction of Indian projects on Western rivers. And there should be the some initiative for the trust building between the both states, and for that real-time data sharing through installation of telemetry system should be introduced, and if telemetry system is properly installed and operated effectively, it would restore trust and minimize the uncertainty and confusion of water transactions and between the two countries. These may include weather forecasting and flood warning telemetry system. So there's a transparency in data sharing regarding the construction of Indian projects, and assessment of the cumulative impact of the Indian hydro project on Western rivers on the downstream flow environment should be shared. And for over 40 years, the Indus Water Treaty has proved best model of conflict resolution, and proactive hydro diplomacy can help in stabilizing Indus Basin regime created in 1960. So do I have a time, or it's up?
You have 1 minute.
Okay, so in view of the growing demographic changes adding to water scarcity, it is the responsibility of the both countries to ensure internal water resources management by following the principles of integrated water resources management, share best practices in water conservation techniques in agriculture, industrial, and domestic use, and the sustainment of confidence building by years between the two strange neighbors, and hence would lead to maintain peaceful relation between them. Resolving water issue peacefully and amicably would be much helpful in developing good relation between the two nuclear powers of South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kishore Munir.
Thank you.
For making a very comprehensive presentation.
Thank you so much.
But at the same time, we have to really look into several aspects of those things that we have discussed.
Yeah.
Maybe at the end of all the three presentations, we'll have some issues on that. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Now I request Dr. Santesh Kumar Singh to make his presentation, and the title of his presentation is going to be on infectious diseases and future of non-traditional threats to national security. Over to Dr. Santesh Kumar Singh.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. And sir, nice to see you, sir, after a long time. Arvind sir, Santesh.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. And could I share my PPT, sir?
Please.
Is it visible, sir?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. Okay, sir. Yes, sir. So this is the time, sir, we are experiencing how COVID-19 is impacting our life, not only our life, but also of states functioning. So I think I will be able to explain that. This is what, sir. Just 1 second, sir. Yes, sir, there's some problem. So is it, sir, visible?
Yes, next to the minus, you're almost there. Yeah, yes. Please press that.
Okay, thank you, Pramod. So my topic is infectious diseases and the future of non-conventional threats to national security. So I'm going to share my thoughts on this. So this is what we are experiencing. I've already said a few minutes back, like modern day public health challenges have evolved from the local, national, and regional into global issues. Simultaneously, they are no longer limited to the exclusive domain of public health specialists. So health issues are among the key challenges to every society and have political and cross-sectoral ramifications. In this regard, public health challenges have become key to national, regional, and global security. And this is what can be said, like earlier we were very much attached with this conventional definition of national security, which much focused on the diplomatic and military security to maintain the sovereignty and integrity of the country. But in this non-conventional security threats, it has expanded its horizon and included other issues within it. While in we go for national security things or policies to make national security, for national security, we include economic disorders, communicable diseases breaking out in any part of the world. Means it is wider, include a lot of things. I will discuss all those things in coming slides. A whole range of diverse global issues have raised the highest level of political concerns, promoting governmental and international institutions to tackle such health threats through the prism of security, be it national security, biosecurity, and human security. Over the past 2 decades, all the nations have renewed its efforts to address large-scale health incidents that have threatened national security, such as HIV/AIDS, disease outbreaks, and bioterrorism. Infectious diseases can challenge national security in many ways, like increased rates of morbidity, mortality, massive damage on public health infrastructure, political instability, and economic volatility. Infectious diseases. What is infectious disease? Are caused by pathogenic microorganisms such as bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi. The disease can be spread directly or indirectly from one person to another. WHO. This is what we have to understand, that is not limited with this in this 21st century. It can spread from one region to another, from one country to another country. Infectious diseases are non-traditional threat, have the capacity to overlap borders and fences, camouflage in the midst of modernity, urbanization, and technology, threatening powerful governments and international institutions, making the helpless millions its victims. This is what we can see since 2002. We are witnessing a lot of the rise of basically diseases. From 2002, it started in China, SARS, then 2006, China, chikungunya, Zika virus, cholera, H1N1, measles, chikungunya, Ebola. There's a huge number of viruses, seen in last 2 decades, which have threatened not only to humanity but also the state structure and state apparatus. The spread of diseases across the globe, we can see here, most of the states have been impacted across the globe. It has impacted the countries of Asia, Asian continent, and African continent, and South American continent. Means almost all the regions of world have been impacted by this rise of diseases across the globe. So, which factor have helped in rising of this national infectious disease to national security is basically globalization, which have helped basically, because conventionally we have been defining globalization as a process fueled by resulting in increasing cross-border flows of goods, services, money, people, information, and diseases. But now this is time where we have to expand it, like by saying the free flow of diseases too, from one region to another region, from one country to another country. The dimensions of globalization we have conventionally given economic, political, socio-cultural, technological, but this is not limited. We may extend it. We need to extend it because that is need of time, and this is what we have to do. And national security and infectious disease, the first development that began to bring health and security together was the general broadening of security studies in 1980s and first half of the 1990s, through which analysts began to consider non-military security threats such as environmental scarcity and degradation, the spread of diseases, overpopulation, mass refugee movements, nationalism, terrorism, and nuclear catastrophe. The development of the infectious disease national security linkage in 1990s flows from 4 important causes: the devastating scale of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the developing world, which is started since to 1980s. Most impacted region can be called African continent. The recognition of the global problem of re-emerging infectious diseases, renewed concerns about the proliferation of biological weapons by states, for example, anthrax attacks in the United States in 2001, increased fears about the use of biological weapons by terrorists. This is what threat to be considered by states. Analysis of national security has historically paid no attention to public health, although biological weapons have been on the national security agenda of the state and have been on the state since at least the prohibition of the use of biological weapons in 1925. So these biological weapons have been considered as threat to national security since 1925, but now it has been expanded due to the rise of infectious diseases. Following World War II, worldwide perceptions of national security was largely restricted to the military defense of territorial borders interests. These perceptions were not much different from concepts of security prior to that war. In 1994, The UN Development Program wrote of a transition from nuclear security to human security, meaning safety from hunger, disease, and repression. This is what we are giving attention to basically, and considering these issues as a national security issue too. So human security issues are being considered by national security experts as a threat to national security in last few decades. Clinton administration national security advisor Samuel R. Berger stated that if infectious diseases creates instability, chaos, conflict, and war, then undoubtedly it has national security implications too. U.S. Government Accounting Office clearly stated that infectious diseases pose a substantial direct and indirect threat to the U.S. national security and interest. This is what first time quoted by any of the document of U.S. Government Accounting Office. Following that view, on June 12, 2002, Congress passed the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act, requiring specific actions related to bioterrorism preparedness and responses. And this is what we can see. This is where it has been shown like public health and national security both in interchanges with each other. Actually, the public health infectious disease and national security linkages, there's close linkages between these two: national security, public health infectious attempts, a generous overlap that includes both biological weapons and infectious disease threats, which produces a broad conception of public health security. For example, biological weapons and naturally occurring infectious diseases, then narrow notion. For example, biological weapons only. So it has expanded now. It has included several aspects too, like biological weapons and naturally occurring infectious disease too. So national security, infectious disease, and globalization. These three, the globalization have been a very important, tool in promoting basically infectious disease across the globe, because it has been instrumental in spread of basically diseases. In the recent case of COVID-19, we have seen how the COVID-19 have spread across the globe within few months and have impacted the global community. So traditionally, the link between infectious diseases and national security have often focused on the effect of health on military. For example, COVID-19, Spanish flu, malaria, yellow fever, and HIV/AIDS. The threat of emerging infectious diseases to the country's internal security is one product of the globalization process. UNDP report on human security in 1994 redefined the concept of security, which expanded from the conventional national security concept to different issues like economic, individual, community, and other issues too. UN Commission in its final report is asserted in 2001 that global health is both essential and instrumental to achieving human security. According to Kofi Annan, peace means much more than the absence of war. Human security must encompass economic development, social justice, environmental protection, democratization, disarmament, and respect for human rights and the rule of law. Due to rapid growth of transportation, the age of globalization, disease are spreading across the world, and all countries are vulnerable to public health emergency. A health crisis in one country can easily affect economies and livelihoods in other countries, since diseases have no borders. Globalization has also increased countries' vulnerability and interdependence. According to WHO Director General Margaret Chan, where the world is collectively at risk, defense becomes a shared responsibility of all nations. That's why all countries have started discussing about global security. No country is protected from infectious diseases, that in order for states to protect their population and their national security interests. National security, infectious disease, globalization. This is what we can see here. Globalization is very wider concept within this. Public health and national security are connected with each other. They are linked. The linkages between national security and infectious disease and globalization have been seen in a few decades. And the conceptual frame we can see here, the shift in the object of security, securing the individual welfare, not state. This is the new trend have emerged in last few decades. So we are prioritizing individual welfare, rather giving too much stress on national state actually. The inadequacy of territorial bounded state to address and readdress the problems posed by infectious diseases. Why infectious diseases, HIV/AIDS, and bioterrorism matter of concern to national security? They pose a direct threat to the health and well-being of very people that states are there to protect. Direct mortality and morbidity, for example of COVID-19, we can see that. In pandemic may cause social distress and threaten the stability of a state. Sub-Saharan Africa, example for us to understand that. A large-scale epidemic may also contribute to economic decline. India, China, and Hong Kong. That can also be seen in the I will go into that. Also affected by diseases. For example, HIV/AIDS has been badly impacted the combat readiness, military performance, moral and defense budget, peacekeeping missions, etc. Bioterrorism have the capacity of overkill. Health can be a cause of migration, which can lead the world into conflict. These are the issues connected with epidemic, diseases, balance of power, foreign policy conflict, social effects. This is the what we have to understand. This can be caused. Epidemic disease can be cause of this balance of power, foreign policy conflict, and social effects, and so that is directly linked with this military conflict, lead to military conflict. Disease and the outcome of military conflict can be biological weapons. Can be a cause of diseases, or biological weapons can be used as military readiness, and the diseases can be used for attacking on public health in countries. So the outcome will be like this, a conflict outcome. There will be conflict finally. Selected definition of the new security. There are different approaches to see this, the rise of diseases, to the rise of the threat of diseases to the national security is a real politic, which is connected with realism. Common security, which can be seen in the context of liberalism. Human security can be seen in the context of critical theory and social constructivism. Ecological security, ecological evolutionary theory. So there's close relations between the different ideologies and different concepts and theories of international politics, with the rise of the threat of infectious diseases to national security. The more general threat from infectious diseases proves harder to connect with the real political perspective on national security. Public health, infectious diseases, national security links poses two kinds of threats, direct and indirect. The direct threat comes from pathogenic microbes invading a state through global travel and trade, undermining military, economic, and political capabilities and thus the state's foundations of power. The indirect threat manifests itself when infectious diseases come to state failure in other regions of the world, causing military, political, and economic instability that adversely affect the strategic interests of other states. Threats posed by infectious disease to national security. We can see infectious disease poses a direct risk to a nation's security by threatening to sicken and kill a significant portion of a country's population. An outbreak of disease or even the perceived threat of an outbreak have significant repercussions on trade and travel for the affected nation. Malaria alone has impacted, for example, Africa's GDP for a longer time. Infectious disease causes significant social disruption through fear and anxiety about a disease. This is what we are experiencing now, present time actually, while we are having this threat of COVID-19. For economic impact, we can have examples from this India 1994 plague outbreak. While India suffered almost $2 billion, it has also impacted aviation and tourism industry of India, and a good number of countries banned travel from India too. So Indian migrants sent to home that during that time, 1994. And another example is Nipah, zoonotic disease in Malaysia. In 1999, the Nipah virus caused the shutdown of over half of the country's pig farms and embargo against pork exports, which impacted their economy and GDP. Avian flu in Hong Kong can be seen. Avian influenza outbreak in 1997 caused hundreds of millions of dollars in lost poultry production, commerce, and tourism. Airport arrivals in November of the year alone were down by 22% from the preceding year. And these cases followed by other SARS, and in the present case of COVID-19, we can see the same story is happening. The entire economy has been impacted by the COVID-19 or corona disease. Challenges to national security by infectious diseases weaken public confidence in government's ability to respond, distort productive economic growth, destroy the underlying fabric that holds a given polity together, promote regional tension and mistrust, strategically challenge the status quo of regional and international system through the specter of bioterrorism and system. Steps to be taken against infectious disease for national security: threat awareness, including infectious diseases related to intelligence, risk assessments, and anticipation of future threats; prevention and protection, including proactive prevention and infrastructure protection; surveillance and detection, including spread warning and attribution, response and recovery for the spread of infectious diseases. In the 21st century, health is a shared responsibility involving equitable access to essential care and collective defense against transnational threats, declares the World Health Organization, WHO. In other words, meeting global public health challenges urgently requires enhanced global health governance. So I'm not going to discuss this global health governance and securities because limited time. So I'm moving to next. International organizations and global security which is directly impacting this, the threat of disease to national security. WHO formed on 7th April 1940, which is concerned with international public health. IHR adopted by WHO in 1969, revised in 1973, 1981, 2005. WHO report on global health security, epidemic alert and response was the first document which described health as a security issue. June 2001, UN Assembly declared disease a security issue. First time UN adopted, declared, and propagated disease as security issue. UN Commission on Human Security was formed in 2003. UN Resolution 1308 on HIV/AIDS and Resolution 6333, 6398, followed by Secretary's report on global health and foreign policy. WHO report 2207 on a safer future, global health security in the 21st century was another document which clearly stated disease as security issue. The International Health Regulation actually present an agreement between 196 countries, including all WHO member states, who work together for global health security. Member states committed themselves to building core capacities in the areas of national legislation, policy and financing, coordination, national focal point communication, surveillance, response, preparedness, risk communication, and human resources and laboratories. IHR also includes specific measures at ports, airports, and global crossings to limit the spread of health risks to neighboring countries and to prevent unwarranted travel and trade restrictions so that traffic and trade disruption is kept to minimum. US national security and fixes, I have picked few of the points from here. Why US have been so keen in promoting this concept, and US have developed linkages between these two, infectious disease and national security. CIA report 2000, which was the first document which clearly stated the importance of these two. In US Government Accounting Office in 2000, clearly stated that national security public the expert agreed that it was a substantial direct into national interest. So it should be considered as national security issue and should be prioritized in this national security concerns. 11 September 2001 terrorist attacks and the incident of anthrax reports in the letters, which also push US government to go into that basically. The US government formed the US Department of Homeland Security in 2001. That was the first case. Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Response Act was being passed by US government in 2002. Epidemic and endemic diseases can undermine economic growth and stability and threaten the political security of nations, regions, and international community. Emerging infectious diseases of epidemic and pandemic proportions pose a serious threat to American citizens and international community. That was being quoted by US Department of State and US Agency for International Development in 2004. The US government restarted initiatives. That is what shows how much they are serious for this issue. National Biodefense Analysis and Countermeasure Center they have established in 2003. BioShield they have adopted in 2004, which later followed by BioWatch, BioSense, and National Surveillance Integration System. This is what have been done by basically a US government to counter this the rise of the threat of infectious disease to national security. In India too, India is also doing a lot of things because it had experienced the first time the threat of diseases in 1994, and that was basically that happened in Surat, while we suffered a lot of things in terms of tourism. And India lost almost $1.7 billion that time. That's why India have considered this issue one of the important components of its national security policy making. And here, this is what India is doing in last few years. This is what I want to discuss here. India is doing a lot of things in this field, national health security field, because of considering it as a national security issue. I'm going to read few of them. So Bharat Mission to End Open Defecation 2014, National Health Policy 2015, National Health Policy 2017, e-health initiatives. India have also evolved a few new institutions to counter this the rise or the spread of infectious diseases like hospital management information systems, Digital India's healthcare online registration system, National e-health authority, and a cloud computing system in health have also been evolved in India in last few years. This is what India is doing. And also India is also showing its commitment to international treaties that is governing global community. If, for example, WHO's international health regulation, India is part of that. Integrated in disease surveillance project, India has also joined that World Bank's assistance program. And India have established and set up the Center for Disease Control Prevention, which closely working with the US, United States of America's the CDC. We have the National Center for Disease Control in the line of US, CDC. This is what the recent example I am going to quote here. India is doing a lot of good things during this COVID-19 and have shown its commitment. In the case of the rise of COVID-19. Yeah, I'm going, but only 2 minutes. And neighborhood policy since India declared while we reported first case of COVID-19, India was the country which started supporting basically neighboring countries and other countries too. In last speech of Modi's last speech in the United Security Council, he himself quoted India have supported almost 150 countries and provided n number of things, for example, hand sanitizer, for head sensors, PPE, anti-malaria drugs, SCQ. So India is doing a lot of things in fight against this infectious diseases. So this is what India is doing in the context of national security. So in that term, I would like to share here, sir, this means national security issues are directly being impacted by infectious diseases, and infectious diseases have been considered by n number of countries as national security threat. That happened in 21st century. Basically, it was earlier too. I'm not saying that was not there. Countries were considering that too as human security, but first time human security issues are being considered as national security threat by good number of countries. Like US have already declared that. Japan have also considered that. European countries also including that. India is about to include that. We haven't any wing, like digital diplomacy wing here in India, which Modi government has included in PMO. And we now in PMO we are having a dedicated digital diplomacy wing. Maybe in the days to come we are going to have a very dedicated health diplomacy wing in PMO2. I mean, that shows the importance of these kind of issues which are impacting, which is going to impact on national security. So the issue is here how to deal with this problem. So that is what can be done only by accepting this reality. Like only talking about military and militarization things, it will not help to secure your own state. So it's better to focus on other issues too, which are impacting national security issues. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Santesh Kumar Singh. I think it was really a good presentation. You have covered a wide ground, not only discussed about the rest of the world, but also you have covered about India.
Thank you.
How public health issues have become so important, how these have gained momentum in the last 2 decades. So very good presentation. So now let me in fact acknowledge that all the 3 presentations so far have brought a lot of important and significant things. And obviously I am sure that there will be a few questions and some discussion on these areas, because all the 3 presentations on various issues, starting from this boundary issues to transnational water issues, and obviously a case study of Indus Water Treaty, and then public health issues, infectious disease. So we have some time for Q&A. Those of you who would like to ask questions, can you raise your hand? And that could really help us to really identify you.
Sir, I have a question. Can I?
Yeah, please go ahead. You are the speaker. You can bring the question later.
Okay, thanks.
It seems there are no questions from the audience. Yeah, please go ahead, Dr. Jagannathan.
I really enjoyed the other 2 presentations. I have a question, 2 questions to what Dr. Kishwar Munir has mentioned in the presentation. You made
please louder, slightly louder.
Yeah, my question is to Kishwar Munir, Dr. Kishwar Munir. You made 2 claims against in the Indus Water Treaty. One is that India has blocked the water flowing to Pakistan, or threatened to block the water from the eastern rivers. That is the one claim you have made it. The second, in your presentation also, you made this claim that India is also building a lot of dams, which is also violates the Indus Water Treaty. Here, I like to, just to bring to the clarification on that. On the second claim that India is constructing a dam, where you have mentioned in your presentation Salala Dam and others which you have mentioned, these dams are runoff river dam projects, which does not mean the water can be stored. And the India has exclusive rights, and the rights are reserved in the Indus Water Treaty under the main waters in the western rivers. India can tap the potential of those rivers for the energy purposes, and we are building the runoff river project, Salala dams, without blocking the water flows. So these dams does not flow, that does not store waters or stop the flow of the water, or not even have the capacity to stop the flow of the waters. And this has been verified and checked by the team of Pakistan expertise and technicians. Even the last year in 2019, they visited in Jammu and Kashmir, and they went and visited all the dam projects which is running. Particularly mentioned about those specific dams, and they are all satisfied. That does not stop the flow of the rivers, western rivers. The second claim about India is threatened to stop the rivers, the water flows to the Pakistan from the eastern rivers, which is Ravi, Bias, the eastern rivers, don't know river, which as per the treaty, India has total utilization of those rivers. So if you see the share of waters which flows into the Pakistan from the western rivers, it is 135 million MF sort of water, million acre per feet, I guess, MF. But in the eastern rivers, 35 million acre per feet, MF waters which flows into Pakistan, out of which last 70 years, India is only utilizing 95% of the waters. 5% of the waters is flows into the Pakistan, which although India has exclusive right to retain that water. Now, Shahpur Kandi project, which is coming up in the eastern rivers, built over the Ravi and Bias. I would like to again, share with this point that it is actually intended to tap those 5% of water which is flowing, even though it is our right to exclusive right guaranteed by the Indus Water Treaty, but last 60 years we were not able to tap those 5% of waters. Otherwise, had that 5% of waters has been diverted to rest of the interlands like Rajasthan and Haryana, we would have had more, we would have addressed the water shortages. Now the water, Nitin Gadkari, the water minister has mentioned in the last year, and also the Prime Minister has mentioned, is particularly referring to this 5% of the water which is being flowing into the Pakistan by through this Shahpur Kandi projects, which India has exclusive rights. I would like to share these 2 points, which is technically, if you see the factually, technically, it is the clarification I would like to share. Otherwise, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thanks.
I think it's very relevant points you have made. Dr. Kishore Munir, would you like to answer now? Dr. Kishore Munir, are you able to hear us? I think she is not able to hear us. Dr. Sandesh Kumar Singh, I think you have a couple of questions.
Yeah, sir. Yeah.
Can you just respond to those questions? Have you seen the chat box?
Yeah, I'm able to see that. I have already read that. Yeah. So the first question is
now, I'm audible.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So I didn't claim about the eastern rivers. I just talked about the India blocked these canals in 1948 and before this ratification of the Indus Water Treaty. So there are the limitation with respect to the design of runoff river plants. And I've just talked about the recently when the Indian Prime Minister in 2019, and he claimed in while addressing a rally in Haryana that Modi promised the farmers of Punjab that his government will stop the water flow and divert the water into the states. So there, I also mentioned few of the projects there. Some of the issues has been settled and some of not, but still Pakistan has reservation. And recently, few days back, Pakistan Commissioner, Indus Water Commissioner, has requested India just to have a virtual session. And Pakistan do have reservation regarding the. I noted your points and they are very valuable. But I was talking about the India's point of view and their recent assertion that they are going to divert the water or they will stop the water flow in future. And that is the not first time they threatened to scrap that treaty. I said that in 2002, when the attack happened, and then after the Uri skirmishes, Modi referred the treaties to said the blood and water cannot flow together. And I discussed this, that why India want to do this, and why India want to scuttle the treaty, and what would be the implication considering that Pakistan dependency on the waters of the western rivers. So there are also the limitations. So India, the treaty seeks to avoid conflict, but trying to limit as much as possible the capability of each country to interfere with the waters allocated to the other. So successfully, the treaty has successfully survived the wars that broke out between Pakistan and India, but the building and the construction, there is a still there is a conflict related to that is Kishan Ganga Bhagliar Dam. Though Pakistan has serious, it's operational. The Pakistan had serious reservations regarding their gates and all that. And with regard to the design of run-of-river plants, there is limitation and explicitly provided and deliberated that, as I said, that it is a very, very technical treaty, facetiously speaking. It's can provide full ground for the future confrontation and conflict that may arise because of the technical nature of the treaty, and that is the very nature of the treaty that distinguish it from other treaty because of the interpretation of the treaty. As well, there is the article that elaborates for the future cooperation. As India flow, or recently Pakistan has asked a few days back to India that there's going to be a flood-like situation, and if India leave the water in the Chenab River. So there are the reservation on Pakistan side, and Pakistan requested India that they want to visit the areas in Kashmir region, but the India refused to do on the concern that they are the security reason. That's why they don't want to. They can't.
It's due to COVID. It's due to COVID reason, not security reasons.
Okay, okay. I noted your point, but
there was a meeting was asked to have it in Atari border. But due to the COVID reasons, we requested to have a virtual meeting. But
let me add here, Dr. Kishore Munir.
Yeah.
If one thing, which has worked well, between India and Pakistan, it is Indus Waters Treaty.
Yes.
During the crisis time, also, both from India and Pakistan, representatives from both sides have met and have shared data. So this treaty, I think, despite India being an upper riparian state, and Pakistan being a lower riparian state,
but definitely, but that is a very strong argument if we rely on the freshwater transboundary databases, that there are the 6,400 cases of water-related conflict covering from period 1948 to 2005, but the Indus Water Treaty has somehow successfully survived the wars and skirmishes and all that, despite the disputed that the issue Pakistan and India had over Kashmir. But on the basis of this thesis, we cannot say that the predictions of water war, obviously, between Pakistan and India are utterly unfounded. So first, even if we accept that there has been no water war in history between states, it doesn't mean that the future would necessarily follow the past, that instead of war, there would be cooperation between the countries.
You are not audible.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, so I was saying that on the basis of this thesis, we can say that the prediction of water wars between Pakistan and India are utterly unfounded, because first, even if we accept that there has been no water war in history between the states, it doesn't mean that the future would necessarily follow the past, that instead of war, there would be cooperation between the contending party. Secondly, there's a thing in the armor of this thesis. During the last decade of the 20th century, it was commonly held that water scarcity could lead to war in international community. You know, Pakistan's situation and dependency on the situation, I was putting this argument on that basis. So that was my point of view, and I noted the Dr. Jagannath argument, and it's very well taken, and I will look into this also.
Yes, that is nice.
So just 30 seconds. Let me add one point. Yeah, this is what Kishore. Let me add one more point. Yeah. In 2018, when Pakistan delegation visited, I was very much here in 2018, October, November.
Okay.
And you see, that is the very crucial time. There were a lot of tensions were going around. you had a lot of issues with the Flurry attack. But the team visited and the team was facilitated and they can go around in any of the sites. And primarily it is located along the most of the military installments and military infrastructure. But there was no restriction for the team to go wherever they want to go in the dam areas. And they are very free to locate. And when they came back, the team was entirely satisfied. The technical team was entirely satisfied and they went and went back and issued a very nice, very satisfactory report. And that also shows this was facilitated by the National Hydropower Corporation Limited, NHPC in India, and they were given taken to all the technical what you are mentioning about that the shelves in the water was releasing this, all the technical that has been shared, the copies of everything has been shared. Imagine this is not happening in if our delegation comes to see. Yeah.
Even during the peak of the crisis, as I said, in 2002, when there was going to be some sort of a war erupting, then also the team had come and India really had reciprocated very well.
Very well, yes.
Yeah, that's these are the very, very valid points mentioned. What I said that recently that can India unilaterally revoke the treaty or scuttle the treaty? That was the argument. And if the question was, if India, considering, and if we keep in mind that statements issued by the Prime Minister Modi, then if they scuttle the treaty, then what would be the implication? That was the whole argument. I hope you get it.
The Prime Minister made a reference to the eastern rivers where the 5% of water which is flowing into Pakistan, I especially reference the Shahpur Kandi project which is coming on the Ravis and Bias. See, the western river water we cannot divert to Haryana. Only the eastern rivers we can divert to Punjab. And again, there are interstate issues, water sharing issues, even the eastern rivers. That is the reason that 5% of water is also not able to be tapped in the north side. Yeah.
Dr. Kiswar is right in one way that there were some debates on India withdrawing from this treaty after this crisis which happened, that recent crisis which happened. There was a debate that India shall withdraw from this treaty because Pakistan really has not been adhering to the larger peace building exercise. But she is right on that sense, but obviously her presentation was that if India withdraws, what type of challenges would accrue for Pakistan? Pakistan would really witness economic strangulation. Economic strangulation will happen if India withdraws from this Indus Water Treaty. So anyway, it's a good presentation. I think there are a lot of issues can be really debated and discussed. The points which Dr. Jagannathan made, I think are very relevant for you to understand the larger contours of this treaty. Dr. Sandesh is there?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yeah.
Can you answer the questions?
Yeah. The first question is like, sir, India is not able to deal with this COVID-19, domestically. So
where are you? I'm not able to see you.
Okay. Yeah, sir, I'm here.
Yeah.
So the first question is like, India is not able to address COVID-19 problem itself here in India. How can it assist other countries? So that is something what, sir, can be said, India is doing quite well in this fight against COVID-19. So it's saying like India is not able to address this. We have to understand how the disease is spreading, how fast it is spreading. That is not possible. We have two choices, whether we have to close our market, our economy, and keep our people inside home, or we have to keep working and going outside with this disease and rise at the percentage of disease. So in this stage, sir, that no, there's not a single state which can take that risk to closing market for a longer time. India have done earlier, but now India have opened that. But we have to understand, being a humanitarian country, India have always been vital in assisting basically neighboring countries and other countries too. So India is trying to balance between these two. That's why we have best example, best outcome of that is India is having the most, the best recovery rate of COVID-19 in the world basically. While we go compare that with other countries, while you compare this with Italy, Germany, Spain, and US, you'll find out India is doing excellent in that field. No doubt, the spread is fast, but at the same time, the recovery is more better than this spread actually. That is what we have to understand. And the mortality rate, because of this COVID-19, is also very low while we compare with other diseases. In the case of other diseases, that too, the mortality rate is very high. But in the case of COVID-19, in India, basically, at least, that is very low. That is almost 1.7 in it. That is decreasing very fast. So India government is quite confident to deal with this fight. So at the same time, India is going to assist other countries, developing countries. So there's no problem. India can do both. Even the days to come, India is going to help neighboring countries and global community by providing vaccines to all.
India has a greater responsibility. India has a greater responsibility. It's not only India has to address its own domestic constituents.
Exactly.
India certainly has to play a larger role. India has to leverage soft power diplomacy and especially the health diplomacy. The current context.
Even such since 2003,
their willingness, they are getting all sorts of help from India.
Even since 2003, sir, India have stopped taking any kind of assistance from any country. India have started providing assistance to other countries. That shows the strength of Indian economy and Indian government. So there's to come, we are going to witness more involvement of Indian government in abroad too. So that is not the issue for Indian government. And the next question, two questions are very much connected. Sir. No, sir, there's a question like the traditional issues, conventional issues are more important than non-traditional issues for for states. That should be changed. What do you think? In that context, I can say definitely that is not given that importance while we make our national security priorities. But in days to come, in the years to come, that is going to happen. Since 1994, while we got that UNDP report on human security, we have recognized n number of the non-traditional threats to national security. And now that is witnessing now in 21st century, in the case of COVID-19, we have seen in the case of SARS, we are witnessing how these cases are impacting our economy, our people, our infrastructure. That is what is impacting directly, associating directly with national security priorities.
Dr. Santesh Kumar Singh, those of them which featured as a part of non-traditional security issues are now turning out to be traditional security issues.
Yes, sir. Definitely.
And this is what you made in your presentation, that how that impacts the national security.
Yes, sir. That is what I'm telling, sir. In the
I
days,
think when the whole concept of human security was coined by Mahbub ul Haq, it was not taken seriously at a given point in time. Now you see the relevance of human security in the current context.
Yes, sir.
And how that is really very encompassing. Most of national security itself is encompassing. It is no more restricted to border management. Dr. Jagannathan is a faculty at the Center for National Security Studies. He will agree that how the things really have changed, especially after this COVID-19.
Yes, sir. Yes.
And the notion of national security has really become more encompassing.
Even this COVID-19 case have forced states to think about that. Seriously. Earlier, we have experience in the case of COVID-19, SARS-2, H1N1, but this is the case when we have realized this is really a big threat. That's why US is repeatedly saying this is bioterrorism, attack on US national security. That's why it is targeting China. It is making responsible China. China is responsible country. Is the bioterror attack. It should not be considered as an outbreak. It is basically attack. It's a plan. That's what the US is saying that again and again. And followed by supported by other countries too. So in the days to come, we are going to see that almost all the countries are going to have changes in making of national security priorities. So in that case, in that context, definitely that will get its due while we make the national security policies. And the last question is at WHO, that there's question mark on WHO. Definitely, he's saying like recently the activities of WHO has been seen as getting increasingly politicized in live up. This is not the point. This is not the politicization. We have experienced since 2002, sir. The first case up to SARS reported in 2002, but China declared that as a threat to humanity, entire global community in 2003. They kept that for a longer time. They kept secret. They kept that they try to hide that fight from the entire global community. So this is not the first time WHO doing that. Actually, WHO have done that in past too. So this is not the first time. WHO is under question mark because of several reasons. In this case of this COVID-19, we can see how WHO have been involved in keeping this case, under the table with China basically. In the first week of December, the first case reported, but till the time 21st February 2020, they kept it like that this is not a human crisis, that is not going to impact anyone, that is not going to spread across the globe. This is not big serious issue. They tried to keep this, somehow in the influence of China. So there is question mark. We can't say like WHO is doing very, honestly, and WHO is really a very global, organization and playing very fair game. That is not there. That's why US is repeatedly saying WHO is no not functioning well, and it is not playing its role in this current world, that is what we have to understand, sir. WHO is responsible for this mistake. WHO is responsible for this outbreak. So in that case, we have to say that WHO responsibility should be taken. We can't say WHO is not responsible. WHO is responsible, and that should be accountable. So in that,
I think it's high time that a comprehensive assessment on WHO has to be done.
Yes.
With a very, very, I don't know, in a very objective manner, because a lot of allegations which have come up in recent times against WHO require more elaboration. I think that is what is needed in the current context.
Yes.
Nevertheless, any other questions are there from any one of the audience? So we have done pretty well, because I was told that we have to conclude this session by 4:30.
Can I, sir, if you permit, can I address your questions?
Yes.
Yeah, sir, you have raised two important questions that which border I was talking about. I have mentioned about 3 border flashpoints. One is the India-Pakistan, the line of control and line of actual control, and also the India-Nepal border. These 3 flashpoints which I mentioned, I'm not talking about in the post-COVID-19, this is going to be more volatile than, and it is more tensed. And also the 2002, the Operation Parakram you refer to, there is a 2002, it happened in 2003, November 26, Vajpayee ji signed a ceasefire agreement. From 2003 to 2011-12, even though Mumbai attack, there was not, unilateral withdrawal of ceasefire agreement from India from that, which means we wanted to, that shows that we wanted to maintain that status quo. And that is the policy of the previous government.
I will recommend that let us not use the word flashpoint. Flashpoint word has to be used by the American scholars, by the West, not by Indian scholars like you. And let us not use the word volatile and tensed. Things are obviously not that friendly. There is no doubt in this. Things have become from bad words. But India certainly has to come up with very measured policy to deal with its borders. India-China border, obviously, in the current times, is raising a lot of issues, a lot of questions, because the perception of India on line of actual control is changing. Because China basically wants India to change that perception. Whatever India had the perception on LAC, that has been changed, as you know, in this Galwan Valley crisis. Likewise, line of control between India and Pakistan, let me tell you, that would be resolved very soon. Question is that how best one can resolve that. And once that really gets done, it obviously the whole question of flashpoint or this thing will not happen. The other thing, India-Nepal, certainly we have no issues. That border is very porous. Question is that India's neglect of Nepal, that really has featured among Nepalese key policy community, and how that India is going to calibrate a strategy which could again bring Nepal in terms of having a very balanced understanding on the new map which they have come up with. So flashpoint on, I don't see that the whole border. See, the most important border, if you see, is the border with Myanmar. Myanmar shares with 4 states of India: Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, and Mizoram. And that, if you see the challenges which comes from Myanmar, that is being handled by India very carefully. Again, you come to other side, this side, Bhutan. I think Bhutan, right now, we have no problem, no issues whatsoever. We have problem with Bangladesh because of the issues of the migrants and the refugees and other issues. Then you come to China. China, the recent crisis, because China is in expansion mode. Pakistan, again, as you see, the border with Pakistan, Pakistan will keep working with a single-minded aim to destabilize India. And that has to be understood by the scholarly community and the key policy community. How best to deal with Pakistan? How best India and Pakistan can normalize the relationship? The bilateral relationship can really become constructive, and that can happen only when Pakistan shows its willingness. Other thing with regard to ceasefire, I think if you make a survey of ceasefire agreement between India and Pakistan, since 2001 crisis, after the attack on Indian Parliament, it is, I don't know, number of ceasefire agreements have been signed, and every time Pakistan has violated. What I was telling you, the crisis which lasted for more than 10 months after the attack on Indian Parliament, where both India and Pakistan had mobilized their army neck to neck, After that crisis, Kaluchak massacre, remember that, 2002 May.
Yeah.
Because that really was creating alarming situation across the globe. And the West and the US, they had issued travel advisories. The Chanakyapuri in Delhi, the embassies, all got evacuated. They thought India and Pakistan will fight a war, and that war will take a shape of nuclear war. 2002 I'm talking about. And then ceasefire agreement was signed in October 2002. So ceasefire agreement has really been, I don't know, innumerable times India and Pakistan have signed. There is no adherence on part of Pakistan to really follow that ceasefire agreement. They have violated all the time. So that is again remains an issue, because that again requires more of some sort of very consistent and dedicated willingness to show India that they are serious in peace building with India. Again, anyway, this debate is going on, and a lot of these activities got stalled because of the crisis which India really experienced last year. In fact, last February. So what I mean to say here that I think a lot of these things I think require more and more very careful crafting of these things. And you have done very well in terms of bringing a lot of issues. There's no denying the fact. Dr. Kishore Munir again has brought a number of issues with regard to India and Pakistan, with regard, obviously with a focus on Indus Waters Treaty, how that really has helped both India and Pakistan to converge. At the same time, there are certain inherent contradictions, which again was reflected in her presentation. How those contradictions can really be addressed by India and Pakistan, again will be featuring in the foreseeable future. Your questions, your intervention were very good. I think this panel really brought out a lot of good issues, especially in terms of understanding India's perception of Indian borders, India's perception of this transboundary water issues, Pakistan's perception of this water dispute. I think a lot of these things, again, very important. And more importantly, Dr. Santesh Kumar Singh's presentation on public health obviously was very good, because as you know, the public health issues never featured as a dominant mode of discourse across the globe. And now everyone is talking about public health crisis, because that really has exposed every part of the globe. It's not that the United States only really had the problem with regard to public health issues. I think every part of the world really experienced, because none of these countries were prepared. India was one of them. So I think that really requires more attention, because public health issue obviously can promote the health security. The definition of national security is encompassing, and that perhaps has to be understood in a broader context. So let me once again compliment all of you for your very good presentations which you have brought, because every important thing you have really highlighted, and this is the way one has to really understanding each other's perception. And that can really help us in knowing in a very better manner.
Thank you,
Other
Dr. Kumar.
important thing which
Thank you, sir.
is,
Thank you all.
Seen in this particular panel.
Thank you all.
Was some sort of an idea, especially with regard to the issue of that how the water dispute or water, in fact, a conflict can really, in fact, keep the nations away from building convergences. And a lot of studies which have been done, and one study I want to quote, that is the study done by the United Nations in the later part of 90s. If there is going to be the Third World War, that Third World War will happen on water. And this report, which really came, really has brought out a lot of important salient issues that how the countries really have to work together. There are a lot of water sharing agreement between India and its neighborhood, India, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Padma Water Treaty, Mahakali Treaty. And there is always a misperception. If you try to really see whether there was a win-win situation for both, you will find Nepalese perspective on a Mahakali Treaty again would be different than India's perception. So again, a lot of these varying ideas which really have brought out in this panel. I'm really very, in fact, glad to really hear these views. And obviously it was a very good learning experience for all of us. So let me in fact thank the panelists for making their presentation. And obviously, in fact, we have learned from this exercise. And I would like to again thank NICE for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
I
sir.
would like to thank NICE and WPC for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Kumar. It was a very interesting to hear lots of new things from you. And it was very learning experience to be the part of the galaxy of stars from South Asia and beyond, all the scholars. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
I would like to thank Pramod too, and NICE and this WPC for providing me this opportunity to share my thoughts. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Arvind sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Distinguished chair speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the end of the session, I take great honor in proposing the vote of thanks on behalf of NICE to all who have graced us with their presence and contributed their parts to make this event a resounding success. We would like to express our profuse gratitude and sincere thanks to Professor Arvind Kumar for agreeing to chair and moderate the sessions today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such a comprehensive and convincing presentation. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, I must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and also those who are watching us live on our YouTube channel. Thank you for your valuable time and attention, and also for making the session productive with your questions. We are truly honored to have had you all with us this evening and hope to stay connected with you in future as well. It's really been a pleasure. Also, do join at our next session. Thank you so much.